So, the story of the first explorers of Egypt's Osirion is one of the greatest stories of exploration and discovery around a truly mysterious ancient site that is almost never told. Of all the mysterious and enigmatic places that I've been to throughout the ancient world, the Osirion at Abydos may be the most mysterious. Not simply because we don't know what it is exactly or what it was used for, but because the more you learn about it, the less certain you become. It's a structure that rewrites itself the more it's studied. It's a monument that pulled curious explorers into its depth, and when they emerged again, they were left with even more questions than answers. And the first explorers who descended into it, into the darkness, the rising water, and the filling sand, walked away convinced that they were standing in the most ancient place in all of Egypt. My name's Luke Caverns, I'm an American explorer, and I come from a lineage of explorers who searched the American Southwest for lost Spanish treasure and ancient artifacts dating back to the 1890s. And this is the first explorers. There is an ancient city in southern Egypt that most people who visit Egypt never see. Abydos, a flat, sun-blasted stretch of the Nile Valley roughly 250 miles south of modern-day Cairo. It's one of those lesser visited sites in Egypt where, if you stand still, you can hear the wind billowing through the halls of the ancient temple, and suddenly you're transported back to a very ancient time. Abydos is one of the most ancient and sacred places in all of Egyptian history, dating all the way back to the very beginning of the dynastic era around 3100 BC. And very likely is even more ancient than that, possibly reaching all the way back to the earliest times of the Pre-Dynastic era around 4000 BC. And over the course of several thousand years, pharaoh after pharaoh would visit Abydos to pay homage to this ancient place. And this is the mystery that the first explorers stepped into when they arrived in Abydos, a place of myth, ancient royalty, and the deep memory of a sacred site that, according to the Egyptians themselves, reached back to a time before time. And hidden behind the temple of Pharaoh Seti I, buried beneath the sand, the most inexplicable and mysterious site in all of Egypt was waiting to be uncovered: the Osirion. So the Osirion was not entirely unknown before the first modern explorers arrived. The ancient Greeks had been there. In 25 BC, the Greek writer Strabo visited Abydos and described what he saw in terms that would fascinate archaeologists for centuries until the site would one day be rediscovered. Above this city lies Abydos. Where is the Memnonium, a royal building which is a remarkable structure built of solid stone in the same workmanship as that which I described to the labyrinth, though not multiplex, and also a fountain that lies at a great depth so that one descends to it down vaulted galleries made of monoliths of surprising size and workmanship. A fountain at great depth, vaulted galleries of enormous monoliths of surprising size and workmanship. Strabo had no real framework to fully explain what he'd seen, because nothing in the Greco-Roman world had ever been built at this kind of scale using stones of this size. He simply described it in the way that a traveler would in ancient times, with wonder and the honest admission that it was comparable to nothing else that he'd seen in Egypt. And he was right. The only structure similar in size and scale and construction to the Osirion is the Khafra Valley Temple standing next to the Sphinx at Giza. But in ancient times, the Valley Temple was buried by sand and rubble, so Strabo wouldn't have been able to visit it. And so, for the next 1900 years, Strabo's well, as the Osirion would come to be called, lay buried under 40 feet of sand and rubble, just waiting for someone to come back down. So, like many great discoveries and explorations, there were no headlines written about the initial discovery of the Osirion. In fact, for years, nobody was even sure where it was. It had been undiscovered for so long that many wondered if it even really existed. The sand of the Egyptian desert is very good at burying and hiding ancient places, and in the case of the Osirion, it had been buried so completely that not even the local workers were quite certain that anything was down there at all. It was in 1902 that one of the greatest archaeologists of the modern era, a man whose name would come to define scientific excavation in Egypt, noticed something strange behind the temple of Seti I, a long, slight depression in the desert surface, a hollow area that shouldn't have been there. His name was Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie. Petrie was, by this point, already a legend in Egyptian archaeology. Famously meticulous, famously blunt, famously willing to sleep in a tomb to keep looters away from his dig sites. He'd spent decades in Egypt revolutionizing the science of excavation at a time when most archaeologists were still treasure hunters with a better vocabulary. By 1902, at 50 years old, there wasn't a square mile of important Egyptian soil he hadn't walked. And yet, even he wasn't quite sure what that depression behind Seti I's temple would represent. He had a hunch though, and he knew exactly who to send down into those mysterious Egyptian sands to find out. Okay, let's be honest. The cost of living isn't just high, it's exhausting. If you've been leaning on credit cards lately just to cover basic costs like groceries, gas, and utility bills, you're essentially paying a survival tax of 20% interest or more. Why keep handing your hard-earned paychecks to the bank when you could be keeping it for your family? My friends at American Financing have a better way. They're helping homeowners tap into their equity to pay off high-interest debt, with mortgage rates currently in the 5s. And on average, American Financing is saving their customers $800 a month. That's nearly $10,000 a year right back in your pocket. So it's not just a loan, it's a total financial reset. It takes just 10 minutes to find out what you could save. There are no upfront fees and no obligation to talk to a salary-based mortgage consultant. And here's the kicker. Start today and you could even delay 2 mortgage payments. American Financing, America's home for home loans. 866-889-5022. That's 866-889-5022 or americanfinancing.net/Luke. Thank you to American Financing for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the show. The second explorer of the Osirion is a name that very few people outside of Egyptology have ever heard of, Margaret Murray. Margaret was born in Calcutta in 1863 and had initially trained as a nurse before pivoting to Egyptology, studying under Petrie at University College of London and becoming the first full-time female lecturer in the field. By the time she arrived at Abydos in 1902, she had already published academic articles on Egyptian hieroglyphs and had developed a reputation for being exceptionally skilled at reading inscriptions under difficult field conditions. Petrie trusted her enough to put her in charge of investigating the depression. And what followed was one of the most physically demanding excavations in the history of Egyptian archaeology. The Osirion was buried under approximately 40 feet of loose sand and formed almost perfectly vertical walls around the structure, meaning the workers had to essentially cut their way straight down like they were mining a shaft rather than digging an archaeological trench. And every time they cleared a section, the desert wind would silt back up and throw sand down into the ancient structure. As Murray herself recounted in her 1904 report, 2 days of high winds once buried an entire cleared section back up to roof level in a single night. She says, "I was able to copy only a very small portion of the inscriptions, for though we cleared the passage to the floor, 2 days of high wind silted it up to the level of the roof." Which is just crazy. There are so many ancient sites that were known in Egypt just 120 years ago that once they were done excavating over the course of the next decade or so, the wind would just completely bury the site. And there are sites even out at Giza that today we know that they do exist, but we don't know where exactly on the Giza plateau they exist. They cleared the Great Central Hall first, and what they found inside defied everything that the team expected. The architecture was absolutely massive, something unlike anything else known to have been built during the New Kingdom. 10 monolithic rose granite columns, each 4 meters high, cut from single blocks of Aswan granite hauled from some 120 miles away. The roof lintels, the enormous horizontal blocks spanning the gaps between the columns, each weighing anywhere from 60 to 100 tons. The surrounding walls were made of red sandstone 5 meters thick, with 17 small chambers carved into them, 6 on each of the long sides and 1 at the back. And below the floor level, nearly flush with the water table and therefore the Nile itself, lay a subterranean moat, a channel of water that would have surrounded a central raised platform like a stone island in an underground lake. It was obvious to Murray that this was not a typical Egyptian tomb-like structure. No pharaoh's burial chambers actually looked like this. The style, the colossal scale of the stonework, the absence of any decoration on the walls of the main hall, it all pointed somewhere much older than the New Kingdom. In her landmark 1904 publication, The Osirion at Abydos, Murray laid out her argument carefully. The other hypothesis was that this was the building for the special worship of Osiris and the celebration of the mysteries, and this appears to me to be the true explanation for many reasons. Each reason may not be convincing in itself, but the accumulation of evidence goes to prove the case. There is no tomb, even among the tombs of the kings, that is like it in plan, none having the side chamber leading off the Great Hall. Then again, no tomb has ever been found attached to a temple. This, as far as we can judge, is a kind of extra chapel, a quote-unquote hidden shrine, as the mythological texts express it, belonging to the temple. A hidden subterranean chamber built for the mysteries. And these quote-unquote mysteries are actually mentioned repeatedly by Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the mid-5th century BC or around 450 BC, where at least 6 times Herodotus alludes to the fact that he had either been initiated into the Egyptian mysteries or had at least been educated in how the mysteries worked. But by the order of the mysteries, he could never elaborate on or reveal their secrets. This is actually the same dilemma among those who experienced whatever happened within the cult of Eleusis in Greece. It was clearly a deeply profound experience that compelled so many people to not only partake, but also keep the mysteries a secret. But there was a problem back at the Osirion. The excavation was not finished. The resources of the Egyptian research account simply couldn't cover the cost of clearing the entire structure. As Petrie himself wrote in the foreword to Murray's report, the full clearance was, quote, beyond the slight resources of the Egyptian research account. And he expressed the sincere hope that the Egyptian Department of Antiquities would step in to finish the job. But they didn't, not for another decade at least. So the Osirion was recovered by sand and left waiting again. In 1913, Swiss archaeologist Edouard Neuville arrived at Abydos under the auspices of the Egyptian Exploration Fund to do what Petrie and Murray had not been able to finish: fully excavate and document the Osirion. Neuville was a formidable scholar, a specialist in Egyptian religious texts and a veteran of excavations across the Nile Valley, and his 1914 report, published in the annual report of the Smithsonian Institution, contains one of the most striking passages in the history of Egyptian exploration. After clearing the main passages and finally confirming the identity of the structure, he wrote, "There is no longer any doubt then that we have discovered what Strabo calls the well or the fountain of Abydos. He spoke of it as being near the temple at a great depth and remarkable for some corridors whose ceiling were formed of enormous monolithic blocks. That is exactly what we have found. Strabo's well. After 1,900 years, somebody had finally found it again." Neuville cleared the entrance shaft, the sloping passage, the transversal chamber, and most of the surrounding retaining walls, and the more he cleared, the more troubled he became by the architecture. Because the style was not just unusual for a New Kingdom Egyptian structure, it was consistent with structures that are much, much older. Neuville immediately recognized the parallels between the Osirion and Khafre's Valley Temple at Giza, the stark, undecorated granite structure that sits adjacent to the Great Sphinx. Both used the same heavy monolithic construction technique, drawing massive granite stones from Aswan. And both sites were built to the same colossal scale, and Neuville's conclusion after deeply exploring the Osirion was clear and controversial. We have as yet no certain indications of the date of the construction, but the style, the size of the materials, the complete absence of all ornamentation all indicate very great antiquity. Up to present time, what is called the Temple of the Sphinx at Giza has always been considered one of the most ancient edifices in Egypt. It is contemporaneous with the Pyramid of Khafre, which to us would be Khafre. The reservoir of Abydos, being of similar composition but of much larger materials, is of still more archaic character, and I would not be surprised if this were the most ancient structure in Egypt. The most ancient structure in Egypt. Older than the Valley Temple and older than the Great Pyramids. Neuville wasn't speculating wildly, he was following the evidence in the stones themselves. Cartouches of Seti I have been found on certain architectural elements, which technically assign the structure to his 19th dynasty reign around 1290 BC, but Neuville and later Petrie, who was also willing to entertain the possibility, believe that Seti I may have built over and incorporated this even older early dynastic or perhaps even pre-dynastic structure. They believe that the core of the Osirion may have belonged to a time before the pharaohs. And this was one of the most controversial ideas published in Egypt at the time. And like all great controversial ideas, it was resisted fiercely and would not be fully reckoned with for decades to come. The definitive excavation of the Osirion was carried out between 1925 and 1930 by Dutch-British archaeologist Henry Frankfurt, working for the Egypt Exploration Society. Frankfurt was 28 years old when he began the work, and over the 5 seasons he spent at Abydos, he produced what remains to this day the most comprehensive archaeological record of the monument in existence, the 2-volume cenotaph of Seti I at Abydos, published in 1933. Frankfurt's excavation was the most technically complete of the 4. He fully cleared all 17 chambers, mapped every architectural element, documented every inscription, and traced the structural connection between the Osirion and the Temple of Seti I, which sat above it. His work settled several key questions. The cartouches of Seti I did appear on multiple architectural elements, including within the central hall of the Osirion, evidence that confirms Seti's involvement in the monument's construction or renovation, which could have happened more than 1,000 years later. The passages leading from the temple down into the Osirion formed a deliberate planned axis, showing that whoever designed the complex intended the 2 structures to function together. But again, the question here is this construction contemporaneous with the original core of the Osirion, or was it added later by Seti I? But Frankfurt also documented what made the Osirion so deeply strange. The entrance passage alone was over 420 feet long, more than a football field, sloping downward into the earth at a gentle angle until it reached the central hall, which sat nearly 25 feet below the level of Seti I's temple. The central hall was essentially subterranean. Its floor hovered just above the water table, meaning the surrounding moat would have been perpetually partially filled with water, with the central stone island rising above the surface like a landmass in some kind of primordial sea. And this imagery was of course not accidental. The ancient Egyptians believed that creation itself had begun with a primordial mound rising from the waters of chaos. The Osirion may have been a physical representation of that very moment taking place in a time before time. The first land, the first light, the tomb, and the rebirth of Osiris played out in stone and water, deep within the earth beneath the holiest city in all of Egypt, leading the initiated deeper and deeper into the monument, as if the passage itself was the journey of the soul through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Frankfurt concluded that the Osirion was a cenotaph, a symbolic and empty tomb built for the performing of the mysteries. It was a place where the death and resurrection of the god Osiris could be ritually enacted, where the waters of the Nile could flood the central chamber and recede in imitation of Osiris' own cycle of death and rebirth. In Frankfurt's reading, this was not just a building, it was a machine for performing the oldest religious myth in Egyptian history. The first explorers of the Osirion, Petrie, Murray, Neville, and Frankfurt, each contributed a piece of what remains even today a very incomplete picture. We know that the Osirion exists. We know it's made up of megalithic red granite blocks dragged over 100 miles from Aswan. We know it contained the waters of the Nile in its deepest chambers, and that those who were initiated into the Egyptian mysteries descended into the Osirion for centuries. We know that Seti I claimed it or repaired it, and we know that Strabo explored it some 2,000 years ago and couldn't believe what he'd seen. But what we don't know is deeper and more interesting. We still don't definitively know or understand how old the core of that structure really is. We don't know whether Seti I built it from scratch or inherited it and expanded something that had already existed for over 1,000 years by then. We don't know why it's one of the only 2 known structures in all of Egypt built from monolithic rose granite in this exact style, or why the only other similar structure sits right next to the Great Sphinx hundreds of miles away. We don't know what ceremonies took place in the Osirion's 17 chambers, or what the water that once filled the moat was believed to carry or symbolize. And even more mysteriously, we have no idea what's beneath the water. It's very likely that the secrets of the Osirion are sitting beneath those dark waters, just waiting for the next explorers to finally descend down and find them. I'm Luke Caverns, thank you for joining me, and like and subscribe for more stories of exploration on the edges of the world.